My name is Scarlett Baker. I'm 32 years old, and the night a joke on speakerphone tried to erase my worth changed everything. Let me tell you about when silence became my strongest weapon, because that's exactly what this story is about. I was sitting in my living room when my husband, Derek Marshall, decided it would be funny to put me on speaker while his friends laughed at things he said about me, things that cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. You won't believe what happened next, but I promise you this. By the end of my story, you'll understand that revenge doesn't always scream. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole heart, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because I know you'll relate to what I'm about to share. Have you ever felt so small that you wanted to disappear, but instead found the strength to stand taller than ever before? The room was filled with laughter that wasn't meant for joy. It was meant to humiliate me. Derek and his buddies, especially his best friend Marcus Chen and his brother-in-law Ryan Foster, were cracking jokes about my weight, my cooking, even the way I dressed for work. I heard every word, every cruel punchline, and something inside me cracked but didn't break. This wasn't about a bad day or a moment of poor judgment. This was a pattern I'd ignored for too long, dressed up as humor. When I finally spoke, I didn't yell or cry. I just said 3 words that would change everything. Message received, Derek. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could almost hear the panic setting in on the other end before I hung up. This isn't a story about revenge that makes headlines or burns bridges in public. This is about dignity that acts in silence, with proof, boundaries, and a plan that nobody saw coming. Today, I'm sharing how I transformed public humiliation into a private revolution, one that gave me back my peace and my power. The best part? I didn't need to raise my voice once. But here's what you need to know. The plan wasn't about getting even in a loud, messy way. It was about consistent, strategic action that served one purpose: my freedom. And if you stick with me, you'll see exactly how silence became the loudest statement I ever made. After I hung up that phone, every part of me wanted to storm into the garage where Derek was still sitting with his friends and let him have it. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, and the anger felt like it could burn the whole house down. But I made myself a promise right there in that moment. No emotional response for 24 hours. I would not text, call, scream, or confront until I had control over what came next. That single decision became the foundation of everything that followed. And looking me tell you, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Sitting with that pain, that betrayal, without immediately reacting felt like holding fire in my bare hands. I grabbed my laptop and created a folder on my desktop called Clear Exit, because that's exactly what I needed. For the next 24 hours, I did nothing but observe, document, and breathe. Every time Derek tried to apologize or laugh it off as just guy talk, I smiled and said I needed time to think. He seemed relieved that I wasn't angry, but what he didn't know was that I was building something far more powerful than anger. I went through our text messages, our bank statements, old emails where he'd promised to change after previous incidents. I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for patterns, dates, evidence that this wasn't an isolated joke, but a long-standing lack of respect. Here's what I learned in those 24 hours. People who seek chaos lose to people who prepare the ground with calm precision. Derek expected tears, maybe a fight, possibly even for me to pack a bag and leave in a fury. What he got instead was eerie calm, and that unsettled him more than any tantrum could have. By the time those 24 hours were up, I had a timeline, a list of witnesses to past humiliations, and a clear picture of our financial situation. I also had something more valuable: clarity. Retributive justice isn't built with screams and slammed doors. It's constructed with data, documentation, and the quiet determination to never let someone make you feel small again. And trust me, what came next would prove that preparation beats performance every single time. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own life, and what I found was heartbreaking but necessary. I started what I called my cartography of respect. Basically, I created a detailed map of every time Derek had crossed a line, made me feel small, or humiliated me in front of others. I went through our text message history going back 2 years, and I found at least 15 instances where he'd made jokes about my appearance or intelligence to his friends. If you're watching this and thinking about hitting that subscribe button, please do it now, because what I'm about to share might just save you years of pain. Have you ever looked back at your relationship and realized the red flags were there all along, just disguised as jokes? I pulled bank statements showing unexplained charges at bars and restaurants where I wasn't invited, credit card receipts from gifts I never received, and I even found old emails where I'd asked him to stop belittling me in public and he'd promised to change. This wasn't about being petty or keeping score. This was about seeing the pattern clearly for the first time. I remembered a barbecue 6 months earlier where Derek told his cousin Jake Morrison that I couldn't even boil water without burning it, while I stood right there holding a dish I'd spent hours preparing. I remembered our anniversary dinner where he spent 20 minutes on his phone texting Marcus about a football game instead of talking to me. I documented the time he canceled our vacation because his friends planned a fishing trip the same weekend, and I just accepted it without question. Each memory was like finding a piece of evidence in a crime scene, and the crime was the slow erosion of my self-worth. I created a timeline in a simple spreadsheet. Dates, locations, witnesses, what was said or done, and how it made me feel. Here's the thing about mapping disrespect. It's like tracing an escape route before the smoke fills the room. When you can see the pattern laid out in front of you, it stops feeling like you're overreacting or being too sensitive. Those bank statements showed Derek spending our joint money on his friends while questioning my grocery budget. Those messages showed him complaining about me to people who were supposed to respect our marriage. The proof didn't just give me ammunition, it gave me peace of mind because I finally had validation that I wasn't crazy. Having evidence creates a foundation of inner peace, and that peace is something manipulators can't touch. When you know the truth and can prove it, you stop second-guessing yourself, and that's when real power begins. And let me tell you, Derek had no idea what was coming, but the foundation was already set. 1 week after the speakerphone incident, I asked Derek to meet me at a coffee shop called Riverside Cafe. Public, neutral, and safe. He seemed confused about why we couldn't just talk at home, but I insisted, and something in my tone made him agree without argument. When we sat down, I had a small notebook with me, and I could see the nervousness in his eyes as I opened it. I started calmly, with no tears, no raised voice, just clear statements. What happened last Tuesday wasn't a joke, Derek. It was disrespect, and it's part of a pattern, not an accident. I watched his face go from defensive to uncomfortable as I listed 3 specific boundaries he'd crossed, complete with dates and details. The beauty of a controlled confrontation is that it removes the element of chaos that manipulators rely on. Derek tried to interrupt, tried to say I was overreacting, that his friends didn't mean anything by it, that I was being too sensitive. But I didn't engage with the deflection. I just kept going, steady and calm. On March 15th, you told Ryan that I was getting chunky and that you might need to hide the ice cream. On June 2nd, you canceled our anniversary dinner reservation to go to Marcus's poker night. On September 8th, you complained to your brother that I was boring in bed. I had witnesses for some of these, text receipts for others, and his own words captured in messages. Each statement I made wasn't an accusation meant to wound. It was a documented fact meant to establish reality. And the shift in the conversation was immediate because facts are hard to argue with when they're laid out with precision. The confrontation lasted less than 30 minutes, but it accomplished everything I needed. I ended by saying, "This pattern of behavior tells me who you are, and I need you to understand that I'm not asking you to change anymore. I'm telling you that this has consequences." Derek looked stunned, like he'd never seen this version of me before. He tried to apologize, promised he'd do better, said he didn't realize how much it had hurt me. But here's what I'd learned. Consistency is the real trigger, not emotion. When your actions match your words without wavering, people start to take you seriously. I didn't tell him what the consequences were that day. I just let him sit with the uncertainty, the same way I'd sat with humiliation. As I walked out of that cafe, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not over him, but over myself, my choices, and my future. And that feeling? That was just the beginning of the shift. Within 2 weeks of that coffee shop conversation, something interesting started happening in our social circle. Derek's friends, the same ones who'd laughed on that speakerphone call, started acting differently around me. Marcus stopped making eye contact at the grocery store, and Ryan's wife, Jennifer Foster, reached out to grab coffee with me out of the blue. She told me something that confirmed everything I'd suspected. "Scarlett, I heard about what happened, and I just want you to know that wasn't okay. Ryan came home that night feeling guilty, and he told me everything. The cracks in Derek's carefully constructed image were starting to show, and I didn't have to say a word for people to notice." When you replace emotional outbursts with documented truth, the narrative shifts on its own because people can sense authenticity versus performance. I didn't go around telling everyone what Derek had done. I didn't need to, because the truth has a way of revealing itself when you stop covering for someone. A mutual friend named Lisa Garrett asked me directly if things were okay at home, and instead of the usual "we're fine" that I'd always given, I simply said, "I'm handling some things that need to be addressed, and I'm getting the support I need." That vague but honest answer did more than any dramatic confrontation could have. People started connecting dots they'd ignored before. The times Derek would make jokes at my expense at dinner parties, the way he'd dismiss my opinions in group conversations, how he'd prioritize his friends over our marriage repeatedly. The social circle that had enabled his behavior by laughing along was now seeing the pattern, and some of them were starting to feel uncomfortable about their role in it. What really shifted the dynamic was when I quietly consulted with a family lawyer named Patricia Holmes. I didn't announce it, didn't make threats, just scheduled a consultation and got professional advice on my options. But Derek found out when he saw the business card on my nightstand. I'd left it there intentionally because sometimes the most powerful message is the one you don't say out loud. External authority, whether it's a lawyer, a therapist, or trusted friends who validate your experience, replaces the back-and-forth theater of he said, she said. And for those of you watching who've ever been gaslit into thinking you're the problem, let me tell you, that moment when someone else confirms that yes, you were mistreated, yes, you deserve better, that's the moment everything changes. The circle of enablers was shrinking, and Derek's control over the narrative was slipping through his fingers like sand. 2 months after the speakerphone incident, Derek and I sat down in Patricia's office for what she called a mediation session. Derek had brought his own lawyer, a guy named Stephen Pierce, who looked like he thought this would be a quick settlement. What they didn't expect was the folder I placed on the table, 3 inches thick, organized with tabs, timelines, and highlighted sections. I wasn't there to make threats or create drama. I was there to present facts and negotiate my exit with dignity. If you've made it this far in the video, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you might save you from making the same mistakes I did for years. Have you ever walked into a room feeling powerless, but left feeling like you'd finally taken back control of your own story? Patricia started by outlining the basic terms Derek had proposed. He wanted to keep the house, split the savings 50-50, and he thought alimony wasn't necessary since I had a job. Then it was my turn, and I opened that folder with calm precision. I have documented evidence of financial infidelity spanning 3 years, I said, sliding bank statements across the table that showed Derek withdrawing cash from our joint account without explanation, totaling over $15,000. I showed credit card charges for a weekend trip to Las Vegas with Marcus that he'd told me was a work conference. I presented text messages where he'd asked his brother to lie about his whereabouts. This wasn't about being vindictive. This was about showing that trust had been broken systematically, and that had value in the negotiation. Stephen tried to dismiss some of it as normal married couple disagreements, but Patricia shut that down immediately by pointing to the timeline of emotional abuse I'd documented, the jokes, the public humiliation, the pattern of prioritizing everyone else over our marriage. It all painted a picture that even Derek couldn't deny. I watched him shrink in his chair as each piece of evidence came out, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because the truth needed to be on the table. Here's what I learned in that room. When you come prepared with documentation instead of emotion, when you present calm facts instead of angry accusations, the power dynamic completely shifts. It's like playing chess while your opponent is still trying to play checkers. The exaggerated demands Derek had walked in with, keeping the house, minimal asset split, crumbled in the face of a paper trail that showed exactly who had violated the marriage contract. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was being heard, not because I was yelling, but because I had proof that couldn't be argued away. The mediation process took 3 more sessions, but by the second meeting, something had fundamentally changed. Derek's lawyer stopped trying to negotiate aggressively and started talking about fair compromises, which was code for, "We know you have us cornered." The turning point came when I presented a recording, perfectly legal in our state, of a voicemail Derek had left me where he admitted to lying about a business trip that was actually a weekend getaway with his friends. When that recording played in Patricia's office, the room went completely silent, and I watched Stephen's face fall. It wasn't just about winning. It was about the validation that comes when the truth can't be twisted or denied anymore. For everyone who's ever been told they're remembering things wrong or being too dramatic, this moment is for you, because evidence doesn't gaslight. What made the documentation so powerful wasn't just that it existed, but that it was organized, time-stamped, and corroborated by multiple sources. I had text messages from Derek's own brother apologizing to me for how Derek treated me at a family gathering. I had emails from our marriage counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, noting that Derek had missed 4 consecutive appointments without notice. I even had a statement from our neighbor, Mr. Thomas Green, who'd witnessed Derek yelling at me in our driveway and felt uncomfortable enough to check on me later. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating a picture that was impossible to dismiss as just one side of the story. The beauty of a well-documented case is that it removes the he said, she said dynamic and replaces it with facts that speak louder than any argument. By the end of the 3rd session, we'd reached a settlement that reflected the reality of what had happened in our marriage. I got the house with Derek buying out my equity over time, 60% of our savings to account for the financial infidelity, and a clean break with no ongoing financial ties beyond the settlement. But more than the material outcome, what I gained was something Derek could never take away. Validation from an objective third party that I hadn't been crazy, hadn't been too sensitive, and hadn't been overreacting. When the legal system, through Patricia and the evidence, confirmed that I'd been mistreated, it was like a weight lifting off my chest that I'd been carrying for years. For those of you who've been gaslit into doubting your own reality, let me tell you, the moment someone in authority says, yes, this was wrong, and yes, you deserve better, that's when the real healing begins. Derek left that office looking defeated, but I left feeling free for the first time in our entire marriage. Once the settlement was finalized, I had a choice to make about the house. It held so many painful memories. The living room where I'd heard that speakerphone call, the kitchen where Derek would criticize my cooking, the bedroom where I'd cried myself to sleep more times than I could count. I could have sold it and moved somewhere new, started completely fresh. But instead, I decided to transform it into something meaningful, something that would turn my pain into purpose for others. I partnered with a local nonprofit called Safe Haven Community Services and turned my house into a temporary shelter for women leaving abusive relationships. Every room that had witnessed my humiliation became a space where someone else could find safety, rebuild their strength, and plan their own exit strategy. The transformation process was incredibly healing in ways I never expected. I repainted the living room from the dark gray Derek had insisted on to a warm, welcoming cream color. I converted the garage, where he'd sat with his friends that night, into a resource center with computers, job search materials, and free legal consultation hours. The bedroom where I'd felt so alone became 2 smaller rooms that could house women and their children while they got back on their feet. Each change I made was like erasing a bad memory and replacing it with hope. One of the first women who stayed there, a woman named Angela Martinez who'd left her husband after 15 years of emotional abuse, told me that the house felt like a sanctuary. She said, "You can tell someone who understands lived here because everything about this place says you're safe now." That moment made every painful memory worth it. Turning the house into a community resource did more than help others. It healed me in ways therapy alone couldn't have. Every time I walked through that front door and saw women sitting at the kitchen table making plans for their futures, I was reminded that my pain had a purpose beyond just my own story. The echoes of Derek's laughter and cruel jokes were replaced by the sound of children playing in the backyard, of women supporting each other through tough conversations, of hope being rebuilt one day at a time. Here's what I learned about transformation. When you take the space where you were broken and use it to help others heal, you reclaim your power in the most profound way possible. Dignity doesn't just survive in silence. It multiplies when you turn your scars into service. And watching that house become a place of strength instead of shame, that was revenge in its purest, most beautiful form, living well and lifting others while doing it. After the divorce was finalized and the house transformation was underway, I had to face something that scared me almost as much as the confrontation itself. Rebuilding my daily life from scratch. For 8 years, my routine had revolved around Derek's schedule, his preferences, his moods. I realized I didn't even know what time I liked to wake up or what I wanted to eat for breakfast without considering someone else's opinion. So I started small, almost laughably small, with a simple checklist I kept on my phone: drink 60 ounces of water, eat 1 real meal sitting down at a table, take a 15-minute walk, get 7 hours of sleep. If you're still watching and this resonates with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications because rebuilding yourself is a journey worth documenting. Have you ever realized that you'd lost yourself so completely in a relationship that you had to relearn your own preferences, your own rhythm, your own peace? The first few weeks were harder than I expected because freedom felt uncomfortable when you're used to walking on eggshells. I'd catch myself checking my phone to see if Derek had texted about being late for dinner before remembering he didn't live there anymore. I'd start to dim the lights at 8 p.m. because that's when he liked to watch TV, then realize I could keep them bright and read a book instead. I started saying yes to things that felt right to me, joining a pottery class on Thursday evenings, volunteering at the animal shelter on Saturday mornings, having coffee with my friend Rachel Miller, who I'd drifted away from during the marriage. Each small choice I made for myself felt like reclaiming a piece of territory that had been occupied for too long. What really anchored me was creating a morning routine that belonged entirely to me. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., make a cup of tea, not coffee, which Derek always insisted on, and sit on my back porch for 20 minutes in complete silence before the day started. I'd journal 3 things I was grateful for and 1 boundary I was proud of setting. Some days it was as simple as, I said no to a social event I didn't want to attend, or I bought the expensive organic vegetables because I deserve good food. These weren't grand gestures. They were the quiet, consistent acts of self-respect that slowly rebuilt my sense of worth. The checklist mentality, simple daily goals that I could accomplish, gave me proof that I could depend on myself, that I could create stability without needing someone else's approval. And slowly, like spring after a brutal winter, I started to recognize myself again in the mirror. Not Derek's wife, not the woman who'd been humiliated on speakerphone, but Scarlett Baker, a person with her own dreams, boundaries, and unshakable peace. About 18 months after my divorce was finalized, I met someone at a community fundraiser for Safe Haven. His name was Nathan Brooks, a volunteer coordinator for a literacy program, and the first thing I noticed was how he listened when I talked, really listened, without checking his phone or interrupting with his own stories. Our first conversation lasted 2 hours, but it wasn't performed for anyone else. There were no friends judging my responses, no audience to impress. It was just two people talking about books, community work, and what mattered to us. That simplicity felt revolutionary after years of Derek treating our relationship like a performance where I always played the punchline. Nathan asked me about my work with Safe Haven, and when I explained the story behind it, he didn't minimize it or change the subject. He said, "That took incredible strength, and those women are lucky to have someone who understands." What made this different from my marriage wasn't just Nathan's kindness, though that mattered immensely. It was that I approached it differently because I'd learned what I wouldn't tolerate anymore. On our third date, Nathan made a joke that could have been interpreted as criticism about my choice to order dessert, and I immediately addressed it. "Hey, that sounded like you were commenting on what I should or shouldn't eat, and I need to be clear that's not okay with me." Instead of getting defensive or telling me I was too sensitive, Nathan apologized immediately and thanked me for being direct. He said, "I didn't mean it that way, but I'm glad you told me because I never want you to feel judged." That moment showed me the difference between someone who respects boundaries and someone who resents them. Our relationship developed slowly, without pressure or performance. We split bills fairly, we respected each other's time and commitments, and when Nathan said no to something, it didn't turn into drama or manipulation. It was just information we worked with together. He met my friends without trying to dominate the conversation. He asked about my day without turning it into a competition about whose was harder. And most importantly, he never made me the butt of his jokes to get laughs from other people. We had disagreements, but they were resolved through calm conversation, not through humiliation or gaslighting. For the first time in my adult life, I experienced what a partnership felt like when it was a safe harbor instead of a performance stage. And the peace that came with that, the ability to be myself without fear of mockery, was worth every painful step it took to get there. Love without an invisible audience is quieter, steadier, and infinitely more real. About 2 years after the divorce was final, I ran into Derek at a local grocery store, the same one where I'd once bumped into Marcus, who'd avoided eye contact. This time, Derek was alone, and he looked different, smaller somehow, less sure of himself. He saw me at the same moment I saw him, and I watched him debate whether to approach or pretend he hadn't noticed. Eventually, he walked over, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Scarlett, I've wanted to reach out so many times." His voice had that tone people use when they're carrying regret, and I could see he expected something from me. Anger, maybe, or at least acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. But what I felt in that moment surprised me. Nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even curiosity about what he wanted to say. Just a calm, neutral awareness that this person used to be a big part of my life and now wasn't. Derek tried to apologize, stumbling through words about how he'd been and how he realized he'd treated me terribly, how he wished he could take it all back. He said Marcus and Ryan had both distanced themselves from him after the divorce, that his family had been disappointed in him, that he'd learned a lot about himself in the past 2 years. Part of me recognized that his remorse might be genuine, that people can change and grow from their mistakes. But here's what I'd learned about forgiveness. It doesn't require me to let him back into my life, to trust him again, or to give him the absolution he was clearly seeking. I could acknowledge his growth without making it my responsibility to validate it. So I said simply, "I'm glad you're working on yourself, Derek. I genuinely hope you treat your next partner better than you treated me." The look on his face told me that wasn't the response he'd hoped for. He wanted forgiveness that came with reconciliation, or at least a deep conversation where I told him everything was okay now. But boundaries aren't cruelty. They're respect for yourself and your peace. I didn't owe him my time, my emotional labor, or my reassurance that he was a good person despite his past actions. Forgiveness, I'd learned, is something you do for yourself internally, releasing the anger and bitterness that would otherwise poison your own life. But reconciliation is something entirely different. It requires trust, changed behavior over time, and mutual willingness to rebuild. I had forgiven Derek in the sense that I no longer carried rage about what he'd done, but that didn't mean I needed him in my life in any capacity. As I walked away from that encounter, I felt a deep sense of closure. Not because we'd had some tearful reunion, or because he'd given me the perfect apology, but because I realized I didn't need anything from him anymore. When you no longer need someone to acknowledge your pain to know it was real, that's when you know you've truly won. Looking back on the entire journey from that speakerphone call to where I am now, the biggest lesson I learned is this: control doesn't make noise, and self-respect doesn't negotiate on speakerphone. The night Derek humiliated me could have ended so differently if I'd reacted the way my emotions wanted me to. Screaming, crying, making a scene that would have given him and his friends even more to laugh about. But choosing silence as my initial response, choosing documentation over drama, choosing strategic action over emotional reaction, those choices changed the entire trajectory of my life. Revenge isn't always about making the other person suffer. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your dignity so completely that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. And that kind of revenge doesn't burn bridges loudly. It builds new ones quietly while the old ones collapse from their own rot. The second lesson came from understanding that justice which truly liberates starts with a calm enough. Not screamed, not begged, just stated with the weight of someone who means it. For so many years, I'd complained about Derek's behavior, cried about it, asked him to change, but I'd never actually enforced consequences. That's what abusers and manipulators count on, that your boundaries are just suggestions they can ignore without real repercussions. The moment I moved from asking to acting, from hoping he'd change to accepting he wouldn't and planning accordingly, everything shifted. The power dynamic flipped not because I got louder, but because I got clearer. And clarity, backed by action, is something that no amount of gaslighting can touch. The final and most important lesson is one I want every person who's experienced betrayal to hear. If it's a joke, both people laugh. If only one person is laughing while the other is hurting, that's not humor. That's abuse dressed up in a punchline. For too long, I'd accepted Derek's "just kidding" as permission to swallow my hurt, to convince myself I was too sensitive, to believe that my pain was unreasonable. But pain is information, and when someone repeatedly causes you pain while laughing about it, they're showing you exactly who they are. Believe them. The exit might not be easy, but it's always through the door of truth. Truth about what you deserve, truth about what behavior is acceptable, and truth about the fact that you are worthy of respect, even when someone you love refuses to give it. My story isn't about getting even in some dramatic public way. It's about getting free, staying free, and using that freedom to build a life where peace isn't something you beg for. It's something you create by refusing to settle for less. So here we are at the end of my story, but maybe it's just the beginning of yours. After everything I've shared with you today, from that devastating speakerphone call to the strategic documentation, from the controlled confrontations to the transformation of my pain into purpose, I want you to understand one crucial thing. This wasn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. This was about recognizing my worth and refusing to accept less than I deserve, even when it meant walking away from someone I'd loved for 8 years. If you've made it this far in the video, I have a question for you that I want you to really sit with. What would you have done in my place? Would you have screamed and fought loudly, or would you have chosen the silent strategy? More importantly, what are you tolerating right now in your own life that deserves that same calm, decisive enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely want to know your perspective, and your story might help someone else watching this who feels alone. Here's what I need you to take away from my experience. Revenge, when done right, isn't about destruction. It's about construction. It's about building a life so full of peace, respect, and genuine connection that the person who hurt you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. Do I believe revenge ever truly brings peace, or does it just feed more anger? Honestly, I think it depends entirely on what kind of revenge you're seeking. If you're looking for the satisfaction of watching someone suffer, you'll never be satisfied because that appetite only grows with feeding. But if your revenge is living well, setting boundaries, documenting truth, and refusing to be diminished, that brings a peace that's lasting and real. The peace I have now didn't come from Derek apologizing or suffering consequences, though those things happened. It came from knowing I stood up for myself with grace, with evidence, and with unwavering dignity. I want to leave you with this final thought. You are not defined by the worst thing someone did to you, and you're not obligated to carry someone else's shame for hurting you. Derek's choice to humiliate me on speakerphone was about his character, not my worth. Your partner's choice to belittle you, cheat on you, gaslight you, that's about their brokenness, not your value. And once you truly internalize that truth, once you stop looking to the person who hurt you for validation or closure, that's when you become unstoppable. If you want more stories like this, real, raw, strategic journeys from betrayal to empowerment, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that silent strength is still strength, that documentation beats drama, and that the best revenge is a life lived on your terms. Thank you for listening to my story, for staying with me through every painful detail and every small victory. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, remember, your dignity doesn't negotiate and your peace doesn't need permission from anyone who tried to take it away.